This place was once alive with families, laughter, and simple island living. Today, it's a radioactive ghost town, and no one has lived here in decades. Welcome to Sailing Sweet Ruka. I'm Kate, this is Curtis, and Roxy the dog. We sailed here on our J-boats J46 and received permission to visit and anchor in Rongelap Atoll. 3 caretakers reside on the island taking shifts to scan levels of radiation, but no permanent residents remain. Coming here on your own private vessel is really the only way to get to this island. From a distance, it looks like a paradise, but a much closer look would reveal a devastating landscape. In 1954, the US conducted a nuclear test so powerful it was 1,000 times stronger than Hiroshima. Known as the Castle Bravo nuclear test, Bikini Atoll was chosen for its location and residents were forced out for their safety. However, 75 miles east was a populated atoll called Rongelap. Due to the miscalculations of the test, a much larger area was affected than they had originally planned for, and fallout rained down here. It wasn't until 2 days after the bomb dropped that the people of Rongelap were evacuated to other atolls, spending 2 full days in the heavily contaminated air. They experienced acute radiation sickness, including skin burns, hair loss, nausea, and vomiting. Just 3 months later, the people of Rongelap were told it was safe to return, but were not told of the lingering risks. They resided here for nearly 30 years, experiencing high rates of cancer, miscarriages, birth defects, and other health problems. However, this time the United States refused to help with the evacuation, and humanitarian aid of Greenpeace in the form of a ship called the Rainbow Warrior made multiple trips to transport the people of Rongelap from their land and their homes to the atoll of Kwajalein. No moving companies to help, they had to leave many of their belongings behind. But perhaps worse was the strong connection to the land that they would not be able to take with them.
Alright, Shalom. I want to start off by giving our praise, honor, and glory due to Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shai, Bahashem, Rakak Wadash. I'd like to give double honors unto the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone who I learned this truth from. And I'd like to say peace and salutations unto the hopefully elect. And today is Monday, November 10th, 2025, Missile Monday. And I have this article from Rolling Stone. Slakia. And it says the devastating legacy of nuclear weapons tests. So I'm just going to go into this article, bring out a few scriptures. Lord willing, this lesson is edifying, straight to the point, and it's kind of long. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I will leave it in the description box, for those that want to check it out. And it was published yesterday by Mac William Bishop. And also, the clip that I'm going to feature in this video is being used for fair use purposes only. I'm not making any money off of anyone else's content. It's simply being used for educational purposes only. So fair use, fair use, fair use. So it says escalating an arms race that could bring about Armageddon is only part of the reason Trump's push to resume testing is terrifying. So it says Majuro, Marshall Islands, LeMayo, Aben learned about snow from the movies played on projectors by visiting American sailors, but living on Rongelap, a remote tropical atoll in the central Pacific Ocean, she had never seen it. So when soft flakes began falling from the sky, the then 14-year-old girl and her friends were enchanted by the new experience. They excitedly began playing with the fluffy white material, but it wasn't snowing. What was falling from the sky was highly radioactive, pulverized coral ash, fallout from the largest nuclear explosion in history up to that date. It says Abin felt her eyes and her respiratory tract burning as she played with the ash. By evening, everyone on the island was critically ill. For years, the United States used the Marshall Islands, where Rongelap is located, as a testing ground for its nuclear program. The test on March 1st, 1954, was called Castle Bravo, and it was 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The detonation didn't go as planned. The bomb was more powerful than scientists had expected. Test observers were surprised by the blast intensity and rapid spread of fallout. They were forced to shelter in place in a protected bunker. Some 7,000 square miles of ocean would be contaminated. So were inhabited islands. Excuse me, Slakia. And if you need proof that, the so-called white man is the devil, this is, all the proof you need right here. Just one of the many things, just to prove to you that he is the devil that the Bible speaks of, man. Because this next paragraph I'm going to read is going to show you that this man has to be taken out of power, It says the Marshallese living in surrounding atolls didn't have protected bunkers, because why would they? They didn't know about that, during that particular time. Or if they did, they didn't think that anything like that would happen. It says there was no warning to locals about the tests, no mandatory evacuations in case something went wrong. In the days after Castle Bravo, residents of Rongelap were evacuated by the U.S. Navy, told they would be able to return home in a few weeks. And again, man, just like when they were doing tests, Slakia, just like when they were doing tests in, Nevada, you had Gad that was still living out in those deserts, man. And I still remember if I could find, the video, I'll clip it, but a Gadite woman, pretty much gave a detail of how, she wasn't given a warning, that the United States, military was doing nuclear tests. She said, just remember, her and her sister, they were about to, go to sleep. And the only thing she seen was just, a bright flash, Then what, the fallout from that, nuclear blast, that test that they were doing. So it's the same thing that they did to these people, which, if I'm not mistaken, the people on those islands, they were Japhites, But again, Esau Edom, he's the devil, man. He didn't give them warning, because why would he? It says, there's a picture of my grandfather holding a baby as they wait to be evacuated from Rongelap. Ariana Tibbuk, a member of the country's National Nuclear Commission, tells Rolling Stone, you can see the scabs that are already forming on their skin. Within a week of the incident, the U.S. government began a secret program to evaluate the impact of radiation on the islanders. 20 of the 29 children on Rongelap will later develop thyroid cancer. Like, come on, man. Like, it says, a fierce advocate for nuclear survivors, Abin told her story for decades, providing testimony to the United Nations. She died in 2018 without ever returning home because, again, just like, Bikini Atoll, was also a part of, one of those, is where they did the test. But, Rongelap, which is about 75 miles away, was affected, by that fallout, man. Because just like I said, they miscalculated, so Again, they didn't give any warning. They didn't evacuate the people, just like I said, just in case anything went wrong. And you clearly see it did, man. You know, it's crazy. It says more than 70 years later, and Rongelap, like 3 other atolls across the northern Marshalls, Bikini, Ragnarok, and Eniwetok, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, is multi-generationally uninhabited due to contamination from nuclear tests. All right, man. You know, nobody can live there because of the high levels of, radiation, that is still left over, years later from those tests that were done, So it just goes to show you that this man is the devil that the Bible speaks of, So I'm just going to read a little bit more. And that's it. And it says arms race. It says, because of other countries' testing programs, I have instructed the Department of War to start testing our nuclear weapons on an equal basis. That process will begin immediately, President Donald Trump wrote in a post on social media on October 29th. The president's declaration appears to have been provoked by advanced weapons tests conducted by Russia, which again, man, like North Korea has been testing missiles, China, if I'm not mistaken, they may have tested, but these different nations are testing their weapons, man. Why? Because they're getting ready to come up against America, It says the president's declaration appears to have been provoked by advanced weapons tests conducted by Russia. Earlier in the day, President Vladimir Putin announced Russia had carried out successful tests of a torpedo called Poseidon and a cruise missile called Storm Petrel. Both can carry nuclear warheads, but that isn't their distinguishing feature. They each use nuclear propulsion, enabling them to travel extremely long ranges. Both of these systems are designed to defeat U.S. missile defenses, says Dr. Jeffrey Lewis, which they will, an arms control specialist and professor of global security at Middlebury College. They are ideas that date to the 1980s, when the Reagan administration was considered SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, also known as Star Wars. They were revived in the early 2000s when George W. Bush pulled out of the ABM, Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, and they remain relevant because they would be used to evade Golden Dome, Trump's planned missile defense program. So as you can clearly see, still to this day, you have people that are still feeling the effects of Esau Edom and its nuclear weapons. It's just like, this year, in 2025, it marked, 80 years since Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed. It's been 80 years since then, and what, that particular test that, Castle Bravo, that was 71 years ago, man, and then even the tests that were done here in the U.S., GAD, the Gadites that were affected by it, man. People have not forgotten what you have done, man, and this is why these different nations are going to come up against you, and whether it's number 47 or anybody else, which we don't really see anybody else being, that cruel Lord that is spoken of in Isaiah, the 19th chapter, but it's going to be him, but, the nation of Edom, you have a track record, man, of destroying the earth, and it didn't take you long, and you having possession of these nuclear weapons help you further destroy the earth. And it said even, that you contaminated the ocean, man. doing these tests. You know, even the soldiers that were there, you know, when they tested that thing, man, it said, it's crazy. Excuse me, Slukia. You know, some of the tests, I forget if it was the one that they detonated underwater or if it was Castle Bravo that they did, man. You know, they had soldiers on boats, you know, and just told them to, you know, sit, you know, and cover their eyes, man. And they were able to see, you know, their bones through their eyelids, man, because that's how bright, you know, that blast was, man, you know. But that's going to be the end of you, man. The same way you came into power is the very same way you're going to be taken out of power. You know, the one thing that, you know, had the world in fear that you possess that had the world in fear now other nations have, you know. So everyone isn't afraid of America anymore. You know why? Because they also have missiles, you know. So I'm not going to, you know, ramble too long, but it just goes to show you, man, that this man has to be taken out of power, even though, you know, there are Japhites, you know, if there were some of our people, you know, that may have been scattered, you know, on those islands during that particular time, you know, we'll figure it out later. But either way, they're Japhites, so they don't really matter. But still, it's just, you know, it's cruel, you know, how this man does people and how he does the planet Earth, you know. These nuclear tests, man, is literally destroying the Earth. But again, the missiles that are on the Earth today, they're going to serve two purposes. One, their primary objective is going to be to, or their primary purpose is going to be to destroy America, you know, Babylon the Great. The other purpose is to, you know, help clean the Earth, you know, because right now the Earth is polluted, you know, and it's going to aid in cleaning it up, you know. So I'm going to start with the book of Revelation, chapter 13 and verse 13. And it says, he doeth great wonders, so that he maketh fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men. And that's exactly what he did, you know, in August of 1945, you know, when he bombed, you know, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan. You know, he caused fire to, you know, come down from heaven, dropping those bombs on those cities, because again, no one had ever seen anything like that before, man, you know. And that's what, you know, quote unquote ended, you know, World War II, you know, because again, you know, the nations waved the white flag, you know, which, you know, Japan surrendered. If I'm not mistaken, they surrendered before they even, you know, dropped those bombs. But they still did it anyway, you know. And this is what, you know, one of those great wonders that he did, man, you know, dropping those atomic bombs. And another person to thank for that is, you know, Julius Robert Oppenheimer, you know, aka the father of the atomic bomb, you know, because this man, if I'm not mistaken, if it wasn't Castle Bravo, you know, I know for sure, you know, he was also behind, you know, the Manhattan Project, you know, but he knew what his creations would do, you know. So let's get that. In Isaiah chapter 54 and verse 16, and it says, behold, I have created the smith that bloweth the coals and the fire, and that bringeth forth an instrument for his work, and I have created the waster to destroy and right man. The modern day smiths would be these scientists and physicists that are behind creating and developing these nuclear weapons. And in particular, you know, we can even apply this, even though it's not directly talking about him, you know, but we can still apply this scripture to J. Robert Oppenheimer, man, because he's a smith, you know. I forgot, you know, what year he died, you know. I have to look into it again, you know, but this man was a smith. He created or helped develop, you know, the waster to destroy, which is what, man? The nuclear missiles, starting with the atomic bomb, then, you know, it eventually, evolved to, these missiles that don't have to be flown, over, particular lands and be dropped. No, these weapons, these nuclear weapons that are on the earth today, can, be launched from one end of the earth and land on the other side just with the push of a button, So the weaponry that they had, in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and so on, it is advanced since then, And again, Castle Bravo is just one of the many, nuclear tests that were on record, man. That was just, devastating, right? But that was, one of the most notable ones that America's done, Castle Bravo. But me personally, if I'm not mistaken, I think the most powerful nuke that was tested to this day has been the Tsar Bomba, that was dropped, in 1963. I forget the exact date, by Russia. It was a very extremely powerful nuke that was dropped, man. The pilot, barely had time to get away, The same thing for the pilot, that dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He barely had time, but, the Tsar Bomba, yeah, that pilot, he barely made it, because that's how extremely powerful that weapon was, man. But what? They have way more powerful weapons than that. And that's a scary thing, man. But what? It's also beautiful, because that's going to be the end of this place, Babylon, man. So staying in Isaiah, I'm going to jump to chapter 9 and get verse 5. It's Isaiah 9:5, and it says, "For every battle of the warrior is with confused noise, and garments rolled in blood. But this shall be with burning and fuel of fire and right," man. This coming world war, this third world war, the war to end our wars, is not going to be like how traditional warfare was fought. You having groups of men on one side of the battlefield, up against a group of men on the other side of the battlefield, charging each other in the center, hand-to-hand combat, having, swords, spears, shields, bow and arrows, these different, weapons of war. You're hearing swords hit other swords hit, shields, you're hearing men let out, war cries, men screaming because, they've been, cut with a sword or hit with an arrow. Like, that's that confused noise, man. But what? Said this shall be with burning and fuel of fire, because this coming world war is going to be fought with nuclear missiles, because again, as I always make mention that you will have ground troops that are going to be going to war with each other, but this war is primarily going to be fought with missiles, man. That's going to be the end all be all for this place, Babylon, man, to go out by way of fire. So I'm going to get the book of Joel, chapter 3 and verse 9. It says, "Proclaim ye this among the Gentiles, prepare war, wake up the mighty men, let the men of war draw near." Slakia, let me read that one more time. It says, "Proclaim ye this among the Gentiles, prepare war, wake up the mighty men, let all the men of war draw near, let them come up. Beat your plowshares into swords, and your pruning hooks into spears. Let the weak say I am strong and right," man. This is what these different nations, have been doing. They've been, upping, their nuclear arsenal. And we can see that with Russia, with China, with North Korea, these different, nuclear armed nations that have been, advancing, their weaponry, that have been exhausting their resources into, their military and into their nuclear programs, man. Ultimately to do what? To come up against America. And even America's allies are going to come up against her, man. Because what America's is likened unto a woman, that's in harlot. and all of these different nations are going to be angry at her, and they're going to, they're going to shoot their arrows over here, So, excuse me, Slakia. Coming back to Isaiah, I'm going to get Isaiah chapter 13 and verse 4. It says, the noise of a multitude in the mountains, like as of a great people, a tumultuous noise of the kingdoms of nations gathered together. The Lord of hosts mustereth the hosts of the battle. And right, man, these missiles are going to make a great noise because you're going to hear that rocket propulsion system guiding these missiles to their particular targets, man, because there's going to be thousands upon thousands of them, making their way to America, So that's that great noise, that is spoken of, man. Verse 5, it says, the Lord of hosts, Slakia, they come from a far country, from the end of heaven, even the Lord and the weapons of his indignation to destroy the whole land. And right, and as we know or should know, pursuing to Genesis 27 and verse 40, Esau Edom's blessing is the sword, which that is his ultimate, sword, the nuclear missiles, because his weaponry just doesn't stop there. He has all type of weapons, but that being his main sword, but what? Yes, the Lord gave him, this technology. He blessed him with that technology, but what is they're his weapons. These are the Lord's weapons, like it says, they're the weapons of his indignation, that righteous anger, and it says to what? To destroy the whole land. What whole land? Babylon, not ancient Babylon, Babylon the Great, which is America. That's the whole land that is going to be destroyed, because this is, the Lord has his eyes set on this place to destroy this place for all the wickedness that Esau Edom has done and for the things that were done unto the children of Israel, man. So the Lord is going to, he's going to pay this place back. He's going to take Esau Edom out, So I'm going to get the book of Revelation, chapter 17 and verse 16. And it says, and the 10 horns which thou sawest upon the beast, these shall hate the whore, and shall make her desolate and naked, and shall eat her flesh and burn her with fire. All right. This is, going into the different nations, these different NATO and EU nations, that are allies with America. They're eventually going to turn on this place, man, because something is going to happen to where, they're going to be angry and they're going to aid in that destruction, that is going to be primarily driven, by Russia, on the small scale, but we know on the grand scale, our Lord Yahweh Shai, along with the angels, they're going to destroy this place. But, Russia is going to be that main force that is going to come up against America, and, its allies are going to aid in that destruction as well, So I'm just going to grab a couple more and that'll be it. This is the book of Revelation, chapter 7 and verse 1. And it says, and after these things, I saw 4 angels standing on the 4 corners of the earth, holding the 4 winds of the earth, that the wind should not blow on the earth, nor on the sea, nor on any tree. And right, these are 4 literal angels holding back, the 4 winds, which the 4 winds represent, the coming destruction, upon this earth, which is going to be here in Babylon the Great mainly. And even the land of Israel, is going to get hit because it has to be cleansed, Says, and I saw another angel ascending from the east, having the seal of the living power. And he cried with a loud voice to the 4 angels to whom it was given to hurt the earth and the sea, saying, hurt not the earth, neither the sea, nor the trees, till we have sealed the servants of our power in their foreheads. And right, you know, until these last few prophecies, come to pass, the time of Jacob's trouble, that primary, prophecy of Revelation, the 13th chapter, verse 16 to 18, the mark of the beast, which is the RFID microchip, being made mandatory. Once these prophecies come to pass, that is then when, and also when the elect are sealed, Slakia, when the elect are sealed as well, then that's when these angels are going to be, loosed. So I'm going to end it with this. It's the book of Revelation, chapter 9 and verse 15. And it says, and the four angels were loosed, which were prepared for an hour and a day and a month and a year for to slay the third part of men. And right, there's a particular set time when, this destruction is going to take place. It's a particular, hour, day, month, and year, when the Lord is going to unleash these angels, to unleash that destruction upon this earth. It says, it's like you, and it says to slay the third part of men, because you have three classes of men on the earth. You have the sons of God, which today are the biblical Israelites, you so-called Negroes, Latinos, Native Americans, the tribe of Judah, all the way down to the tribe of Issachar. You have the sons of men, which are you different heathen nations. And you have the sons of the wicked, which are, you so-called white people, the nation of Edom. That's who this destruction is primarily for. It's for you, the third part of men. And, you will have 2/3 of the nation of Israel that are going to get caught up in this destruction. And whatever heathens that, didn't return into their homeland, before this destruction comes, you're just collateral damage. You're just over here to make a little money and be destroyed. Verse 16, and the number of the army of the horsemen were 200,000. And I heard the number of them. And again, that's how many missiles are going to hit this place, man. 200,000, man. 200 million, warheads, are going to destroy this place, man. And the latter verses are just giving a description of the missiles, the warheads in particular, So Lord willing, this lesson was edifying. I want to give all praise, honor, and glory due to Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shai, Bahashem, Rakak Kodash. I'd like to give double honors unto the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone who I learned this truth from. And I'd like to say peace and salutations unto the hopefully elect. Till the next time I say, Shalom.